to reconsider some of the principles of intentional communities, as well as perhaps some of their essential characteristics and their practices, and not to focus too much on historical examples going into the history of any particular commune as such. So that's precisely what I did. And therefore, you're going to hear me at times make reference to various communal experiments that have taken place historically, but I'm not going to be in any position to elaborate and discuss those communities until we come to the end. All right? Just so you have some idea of that. So I began by asking myself a pretty simple question. In fact, I asked myself several questions with respect to communities and intentional communities. And before I proceed, I will do what I do in all of my classes at the beginning, asking you to please turn off all cell phones. I didn't think of it at the beginning, but now that we're clear. All right. Well, I'm going to read out several thoughts. And at a certain point, I'll just pause and turn it over to Maurice. Because as usual, when one begins to be puzzled and to raise some questions, to try to sift through it and to come up with some principles or ideas that seem to be clarifying and helpful, hopefully, one finds oneself suddenly there's a kind of fertility that occurs, and the mind is suddenly spinning and spawning off ideas. And so one has to kind of slow down and sift and try to present it in some fashion that's clear and relevant. So I have a number of thoughts based on simple questions. And the first obvious question that I posed, well, what is really the foundational principle of all intentional communities, all communities really per se? As soon as I posed that question, what came to mind immediately was Plato's Republic. Now, all I did was extract from there a very simple point, but very powerful one. Let me just read to you this thought. All societies arise because of human interdependence. No individual is entirely self-sufficient, since all individuals have needs that cannot be met except by cooperation with others. That's pretty straightforward. It seems reasonable, don't you agree? We are genuinely interdependent. And in a sense, we cannot really express our full potential as human beings except by recognizing and cooperating with that essential truth or essential fact. As soon as this came to mind, then another question occurred. Well, if we are interdependent and we have needs that cannot really be met except in community, then are there different kinds of needs? And I thought this was important because it seems, on reflection, that human needs can be stratified. And I mean by that very simply that we can speak in terms of higher order needs and lower order needs. Well, what do I mean? And how is this relevant to communities? There are higher order intellectual and spiritual needs, as well as lower order material needs that must be satisfied for there to be a vital and viable community. What are higher order needs? Well, let me just mention this. Higher order needs involve the cultivation of intellectual and spiritual capacities, the acquisition of knowledge, and the flowering of moral and social virtues. What are lower order needs? Lower order needs involve the satisfaction of psychophysical necessities that are crucial for sustaining life Without them, in fact, the fulfillment of higher order needs is very problematic. For example, people or communities who are poor and destitute need work and bread. They cannot possibly participate very easily in intellectual and spiritual culture. If you are without food or without the basic necessities, it's very difficult to speak to someone about cultivating their intellectual and spiritual qualities and capacities. As Gandhi said, to the man who's starving, bread is God, and bread is what he needs, and work is what he or she needs, and they're in no position to do anything. If you think of the slums of the world, you think of Mexico City, you think of New York City, you think of Calcutta, you can think of anywhere where there are concentrations, Bombay, Mumbai. You can think of places where there are, I do not mean to imply there's not culture there at all, but it is necessary to see that material needs are met at some sustainable level for people to have the freedom and the latitude to cultivate consciously and in community and in cooperation with each other these higher qualities that need to be expressed. Interestingly enough, the mere satisfaction, however, of material or creature needs does not necessarily lead to the unfoldment of intellectual and spiritual development. For example, people or communities that enjoy material abundance or unusual prosperity, but don't actively seek opportunities for intellectual engagement and creative social encounters, tend to do what? They tend to slip into lassitude, self-indulgence, and isolationism. If we want any examples of this in America, as someone pointed out in a book that I heard reference to recently, just go to any suburban household. Suburbia has become a place where people don't really engage very much anymore. It becomes an isolationist community within the community. But at any rate, a mere flourishing of material well-being and wealth doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to then consciously cultivate what would be, the Greeks used to call intellectual culture and spiritual aspirations, which lead to the full development of the human being. So the highest community then attempts to harmonize the spiritual, the intellectual, and the material for the growth of the individual, all individuals. And therefore, by the way, when you say that community involves the harmonization of spiritual, intellectual, and material needs, it's interesting how an excess or deficiency of either of the three results in challenges and problems to any given community. And this happens in intentional communities that are religious and secular. So it is an interesting point. Why, in the broadest sense, do intentional communities arise? Looking specifically at intentional communities. Well, they usually arise because of excess or deficiency perceived in the general culture of society in relation to the three elements or aspects that I mentioned: the spiritual, the intellectual, and the material. Intentional communities can be conscious correctives to what are perceived to be deficiencies or injustices or incompleteness in our contemporary society. People don't usually create an oasis within a given paradise. If paradise exists on earth, there's no need to generate, to spawn, to create, to initiate intentional communities that are small focal points for some kind of individual and communal development. It's usually when there's perceived to be something that is lacking, that needs to be corrected, that we have the formation of intentional communities. And so that's certainly, when you look at New Lanark, Scotland, Robert Owen's magnificent experiment in education in this little town in Scotland, in the early 19th century, it was because he perceived a lacking, a deficiency, in terms of the intellectual and social development of children who were working in factories. And he bought a whole town. And he bought the factory and the whole town with the intent of trying to pull out children from this situation and provide them with an education. So he was very much someone who was trying to deal and correct a problem. Well, there are other communities that do see similar things. The Shakers came from England. They were part of the Quakers, actually, but they were called the Shaking Quakers because they shook a lot when they were involved in prayer and ceremony, and so they broke off independently and became known as the Shakers. Well, they also perceived a deficiency in Christian theology and Christian understanding. And so because of that, they wanted to rectify it, and they began to, they formed, as the Quakers did, their own community. And when they emigrated to America, they did some rather marvelous things, despite other limitations that we might believe to be the case. Intentional communities not only arise out of deficiencies, perceived injustices, incompleteness, but they also arise often out of a shared vision of a better society, one that integrates the spiritual, intellectual, and material in a more wholesome and effective way than occurs in present society. For example, New Harmony, community initiated by Robert Owen in this country after he set up New Lanark. He came to America and set up what was called New Harmony in Indiana. It wasn't so much because of a sense of deficiency or injustice, but because, like so many Enlightenment figures, he felt that society should always be progressive, that because of reason and science, and because of human discovery of the importance of equality, that this is what needed to be elaborated more fully. So it wasn't just a sense of deficiency, but a need to elaborate and fully elaborate a principle of equality that people were beginning to recognize and to see on a rational basis to be extremely important. And there were others also, oddly enough. The Oneida community in this country in New York City, which was a religious community, they also believed in progressiveness, that they weren't just acting or reacting to being persecuted. They actually had a totally different conception of what Christianity should be about. And they felt that the second coming had already occurred, and that they were concerned with perfection, not evil and sin. So the Enlightenment focus on the possibilities of human growth and of society's reformation and infinite progress also spilled over into Christian thought, into Christian belief, into Christian theology. But usually most intentional communities arise because of a combination of both seeing something lacking, seeing something needed, seeing something forgotten, seeing something that needs to be reformed, or having a fresh vision of what needs to be done. And that therefore it ends up incorporating both elements, looking for an alternative social reality. Globally speaking, turning now, having thought about this, about higher needs, lower needs, interdependence, then the question I raise, well, globally speaking, what might be some paradigms of intentional communities? And it was a question to which I wasn't sure there was any specific answer at first, and then lo and behold, cascading into the mind come suddenly several possibilities once I thought back. For example, the Pythagorean community in 6th century BCE. Would the Pythagorean community of ancient 6th century Greece be a paradigm of an international community with its quest for divine wisdom, its emphasis on harmony, unity, and brotherhood, its renunciation of private property, and its desire to uplift the Greek city-state? Yes, it would be a paradigm. Would the Buddhist Sangha of ancient 6th century India be a paradigm of the intentional community? with its emphasis on cultivating spiritual insight, on compassion, and on unconditional service to the community? Yes, it would be a paradigm. Would Gandhi's ashram in modern India be a paradigm of the intentional community, with its emphasis on truth, nonviolence, social reform, and service to the nation as a whole? Yes. Why wouldn't it be considered a paradigm of intentional community? Then, this question occurred. With the founding of the American Republic in the 18th century, with its conscious declaration of the principles of liberty and equality, be a paradigm of an intentional community? The fact that it's a nation doesn't preclude it from being an intentional community. Globally speaking, the American Republic was a micro-community and a radical departure from the principles and practice of the macro-community of nations of the time of its inceptions. It certainly was radical. It certainly was considered to be a democratic experiment. So the American Republic was a deliberate democratic experiment whose principles of liberty and equality were expressed eloquently in the Declaration of Independence, and later on, and perfectly formulated in the Constitution of the United States. Despite its revolutionary character, America, or perhaps because of it, America has subsequently spawned numerous mini-communities within its national boundaries, as well as inspired other mini-communal experiments throughout the globe. I wish to say, when I mentioned that there are paradigms, historically speaking, going back to the 6th century BCE with the Pythagorean community, the Buddhist Sangha, and others. There are the Essene communities in Christianity. You can also speak in terms of Gandhi in contemporary India, and you can speak, of course, as I was saying, as of America. But paradigms, all community paradigms are relative to their unique historical circumstances, but at the same time, Bob, true paradigms are really teaching models. Since every truly magnificent social experiment possesses universal elements or characteristics that can be revitalized in a new form to suit the needs of an age. I felt it was important just to mention, I always like to mention, because I was taught this, and it seems so helpful, always think in terms of the best that you can understand, that you can visualize, that you can learn from, because ultimate models can always be reflected in many different forms. That's the beauty of them. And that's why it's beautiful to have many paradigms, not just, quote, one paradigm. I love the thing I read in a book once, many years ago, about someone saying, you know, when you talk to a Hindu about certain things, as an American, it gets so confusing. And I'm thinking, now, what's he talking about? He said, when you ask them, is this the best? You point to something. Is of these various art pieces, is this the best? You know, the American question, what's number one? So he, oh, yes, that's the best. Well, what do you think about this one? Oh, yes, that's the best. And he said, so every time I ask him about something, that would be the best. And I was confused. He said, well, why can't each of them be the best in its own way? Why are you so obsessed with one being the ultimate answer, one being the ultimate model, one being an all-inclusive, forever paradigm? Paradigm shift. There are paradigm shifts in science, what we call empirical science. We know there have been paradigm shifts. Einstein certainly was a paradigm shift from Newton. As the people reported when Einstein submitted his essay in 1904, and it took the magazine that he submitted it to 18 months to respond, and he was confused. He was a clerk, as we know. And finally he got a letter. Dear Dr. Einstein, dear Einstein, whatever, just to let you know, we are going to be publishing your article. It just took us a while to find someone who felt they were qualified to understand it. So shifts in paradigms can be challenging. Well, what might be the primary characteristics or qualities of this paradigmatic notion of intentional communities that try to encourage or cultivate in some dynamic relationship the spiritual, the intellectual, and the material? Because we want to always hold up the best, despite the fact that certain communities rarely try some of the others, but we still want to hold that up. All right, first of all, it seems like when you look at different intentional communities, you find what is really important are just some of the following, and I'll mention these, one of which is vision. There must be a fresh vision of the beloved community, of an alternative social reality, of a feasible notion of the collective good. As the Bible says, without a vision, the people perish. Having a vision. Someone has to have a vision. For there to be any possibility of initiating a commune or community within the larger community that is a deliberate, rational attempt, or some form of attempt to start something fresh. A vision must spell out not only a new paradigm, a fresh utopia, but it must erect a ladder that takes those who share in the vision from where they are now to where they wish to be. Such a vision may be put in a variety of ways and in a number of compelling images, but it must point to a more desirable way of life or a more wholesome condition than presently prevails. Visions of a new Jerusalem or a new utopia can come about in a number of diverse ways. Visions can be a result of intuitive awakening, as must have taken place with the wise Pythagoras, which did certainly take place with the Buddha as a result of his enlightenment experience, and which is also, by the way, chronicled in the writings of Thomas Paine in America when he spoke of seeing before his mind's eye that America would be the nation that would usher in a new world order, a new order of the ages. He speaks explicitly about one evening when he was engaged in reflecting, contemplating this marvelous country, this new possible nation that suddenly before the mind's eye unfolded this incredible vision of what America could be. And he's the one that gives us the United States of America as a title. And he was a principal architect of this country in terms of its fundamental principles. Now, a vision can also come about not only because of an incredible intuitive insight or vision, quote unquote, but as a result of deep rational thought as well. A universal human principle such as equality, which happened in the case with Robert Owen, who I referred to, the Englishman who founded New Lanark, Scotland, and also New Harmony in here. He simply pondered and pondered the human condition and felt that equality was central and felt that human beings were imprisoned because of their environment, because of their social and economic conditions. And if you change people's social and economic conditions, if you go about it in the proper way, you can help people evolve character and characteristics that lead to full happiness and full enjoyment of life and exercise of their full powers and potentialities. And in addition to that, I might mention that the visions that found certain communities, certainly in America, were not the result of necessarily a deep intuitive insight in the sense in which, the Platonic sense in which I mean it, nor in terms of just rational reflection, but some communities were actually spawned and initiated and survive today because of a, quote, revelatory experience, because individuals had revelations of a spiritual or religious kind. And so they perceived in their vision a kind of a new celestial order on earth. This happened to Ann Lee, a Shaker, when she came. She came to America with herself and 5 other people. She immigrated here because she felt that here was going to be the new founding of a new second coming. That was her inspiration. And by the way, she enunciated and she worked out a system in which men and women were entirely equal. And this is in the 1770s. Very interesting. Now, in addition to a vision, there are also, and this I want to be sure to let you know, vows. Communities often fail because of lack of commitment. But Gandhi pointed this out, and so have others. How can I put this? If you're going to go against the social grain, it is not easy to do, as one is pioneering a new social path, and more likely than not, to inflame some of the local people, as well as to ignite a war within yourself. Because when you go to do something different, you're challenging your previous habits. It just isn't that simple to form a community and to be different and to be reformed. Vows are critical components of a number of important human activities: for initiating the marriage bond, for the sake of entering a monastery, in order to join the military, for assuming the responsibility of public office, for having the privilege of being a physician of the human body. Every one of those takes an oath, a vow. And that's supremely important. Vow-taking in intentional communities takes different forms. The taking of an oath is a precondition, or was a precondition, for being a member of the Pythagorean community, for being a member of a Buddhist monastery or nunnery, and also for participating in the Gandhi community. The signing of a covenant was necessary for joining the Shaker community. A declaration of faith through adult baptism was and is a requirement for being an accepted member of the Amish communities across America. You can't enter it unless you make a declaration of commitment to principles. In addition to this, leadership is supremely important. An intentional community needs a person or persons who can articulate the common vision. They must also enjoy some degree of credibility, and most importantly, possess daring, imagination, and a serene detachment from the criticisms of mainstream society, which might see the community's vision as eccentric, off-center, and peculiar. And certainly, when you look at any prominent paradigmatic community, you will find its heartbeat usually lies with the leadership of someone who's exemplary of its vision, and who exemplifies it in practice and makes it very powerful and potent through the propaganda of the example and the deed. In addition to that, the communities, when you look at them across a span of time, also need to attempt to cultivate spiritual, intellectual, and social virtues. Let me mention just a few, so I don't give you just a lot of detail. There are certain qualities in a human being that any form of family or communal life can make more present, more powerful and effective, and more uplifting, and mutually helpful to everyone. In terms of spiritual qualities, for example, in the Pythagorean community of ancient Greece, reverence was central. Reverence, a word we don't use very much, but the quality is supremely important. Reverence for the oath that you take. How many doctors have reverence for the oath, the Hippocratic Oath? Some do. They're extremely conscientious. very patient-friendly and very patient. But many doctors forget the oath. By that, people who go into public office make wonderful declarations of public responsibility and duty, and how easy it is to forget. So it's necessary not only to have a vision, to make a commitment or a resolve that in some sense is meant and sacred, and also to see leaders and be inspired by them, because a leader above all must inspire people to follow a vision and to give up all that has to be given up to make anything work, whether it's in a family, a community, or a nation. So qualities are encouraged. They need to be brought out. One of which is reverence. And in the case of the Pythagorean community, it was reverence for the oath, for the divine in the cosmos, and for the divine in man. And wonderfully, one of my favorite phrases is in the golden verses of Pythagoras, where he says, "Revere the heroes who are full of goodness and light." What a beautiful statement. Revere the heroes who are full of goodness and light. Heroes, heroines, all across the globe. Anytime one reveres them, one is elevated, one is helped. That's a beautiful thing. Children know it naturally. When you put before them someone who's admirable, and they give their heart to it, and they love that person, they are elevated and they assimilate something of that person by their love of them. Because children learn through loving, not through reason. It's only later that you learn through reason. So the quality of reverence, compassion, love, humility are all important. The Buddhist Sangha stresses compassion. The Amish community stresses what? Humility. They're the simple folk. They like to simplify, simplify, simplify. On the material plane, simplify. But also be humble. Don't be arrogant, pushy, aggressive, aggrandizing. Don't push yourself forth. It's an interesting point. Could we use more of that in the world? I think so. Gandhi in his ashram, love and nonviolence was important. So it was the teachers of St. Francis, too. Now there's also ethical and, intellectual or cognitive virtues as well. Self-questioning. I don't mean doubting oneself, but questioning one's assumptions, one's belief, things that one's embrace. There are many things we embrace that need to be questioned, not to be rejected, but to be amplified and to elaborated and made practical. And so you need to develop certain intellectual and cognitive virtues. There are also social virtues, of course, which is what a community is about as well. Cooperation, sharing, hard work, responsibility. Most intentional communities encourage this, of course. And all these virtues, whether spiritual, intellectual, or social, are essential to community growth and individual flourishing. By the way, I discovered, many of you might have known this, but the Greek word for happiness, philosophers say that when you look at the word, what we translate by happiness as personal psychological happiness is not apparently what they meant. The word means flourishing. And you don't flourish just by getting what you want or what you wish, unless what you want is of a higher order. Wholesomeness is another word for happiness. Inclusiveness, completeness. You can go to a physician and say, hey, I'm feeling fine, I'm feeling great. I feel healthy. But the physician, when he studies your symptoms and looks at the tests, might say, you might feel personally healthy, but you're not. There's a disequilibrium in your system, as the Pythagoreans used to say. There is a imbalance. There's a problem. So even though we might feel happy at the moment, it doesn't mean we're happy in a fuller sense, because there's something lacking in a wider sense. Let me just read you one thing, because, and then I'll end. I was reading a wonderful article from Carol's, the Pacific Standard. I've read like 2 fascinating articles recently, one of which on genetics, is stunning and even makes the case for community, actually. It actually makes the case for community when it shows you that a lot of our cells are really processing our experience and converting it into biology. We're not isolated, insulated, individualized biological units independent of our environment. And furthermore, it doesn't negate free will either. It's very interesting, very fascinating, but it shows you're part of a community of nature, but also your relationship with people. If you do not have social connection, your biology changes. When you connect with other people, your biology begins to change and your gene expression begins to change and your whole attitude begins to change. They noticed that young children who were abused, when they had one person who they met with once a month and took an interest in them, genuinely, and they had that to look forward to, they healed far more quickly and far more fully than people who never made connections. They've now determined by research at UCLA, by Steve Cole, that your health and your psychological health has to do with social connections, community connections. The more you have wholesome relationships, your immune system functions differently, and your whole well-being functions differently. And then I read this other study, and this will be my last point before I turn it over to Maurice, because I have all kinds of other things I was going to say, but I'll leave it alone. This was according to David De Steno, professor of psychology at Northwestern Universities. What they found is this. They call it emotions, and philosophers would make different distinctions between appetites, emotions, feelings, and qualities, virtues. But that's okay, it doesn't matter. What they found out was, by various experiments over time, that the, quote, emotion or feeling of gratitude is absolutely amazing when people feel gratitude to others. What it does to the health of that person and their capacity to flourish as a human being and to stay with things and to be disciplined. In other words, self-discipline is extremely important in any family or community. And when you are disciplining yourself and cooperating with others, it's amazing how what is potential in each individual, and it comes out more clearly. One of the things Gandhi said was that until people understand the importance of self-discipline, they'll never gain self-knowledge. And when they don't gain self-knowledge, they'll never be able to distinguish between the good in themselves and that in themselves which is not good. And if they can't distinguish it within themselves, those qualities and tendencies which are wholesome and helpful from those which are not, they'll never be able to completely develop as a human being. And this is what happens in communities. The saint is not the ideal person in the community. The saint focuses on goodness. The sage focuses on wisdom. And to Gandhi, the ideal member of a community is the sage, not the saint. Gandhi said, I'm perfectly well aware of the limitations, defects of the people that I interact with, because I'm quite aware of my own. And I don't have a problem with accepting them. And in fact, I always emphasize their good points and their good qualities, and I hold out for the possibility. But if you're blind to your own faults, and you're not willing to honestly look at the faults as well as the virtues of others, you won't have a community that survives. People will hide from things. One of the interesting things that was done by the Oneida community was they had something called mutual criticism. Because one of the things I was going to get into, and I just no time for, how do you deal with rule breakers in every community? There's a whole problem. Who do you allow to enter, and how do you get rid of people who shouldn't be there? Some communities have very strict criteria over who's allowed to enter, particularly religious ones, right? So you have to follow certain strict criteria to be even a part of their community. So they don't have a problem. You have something like New Harmony and Brook Farm in Massachusetts and New Harmony in Indiana. They had almost no criteria. They lasted 2 years. Okay, so the membership was easy, but also nobody took with anything. Although it's a little different in New Haven than it was. I mean, in New Lanark, sorry, New Harmony than it was at Brook Farm. There was a difference, but still, very lax criteria for membership. Usually doesn't last very long. On the other hand, what to do with people who are creating a problem. One of the things was Oneida community, or a religious community, Christian community, had something called mutual criticism. You were invited to sit down while a whole committee of your fellow peers spoke about you publicly for about a half an hour. You can imagine. They gave a description of one person who was there and made a record of it. And there sat Tom. And slowly but surely, as everyone went around the circle, pointing out Tom's virtues and weaknesses, Tom broke out in a sweat across the forehead by the time they got around the circle, because they didn't mince things. They were very honest about what they believed and perceived to be good and what they felt was lacking. And then at the end, you were given incredible encouragement to not take it to heart in the wrong way, because everybody has their turn, including even the leader of the community had to go through the same thing. They figured this is a way you get people to be more self-aware, to be more aware of what it is you need to do. And so that was their solution. Now, the Amish, what do? They have something called shunning, right? Did you see the movie The Witness? It's a wonderful movie, by the way. My daughter and I watched it again last night. We watch it about every 2 years. It's coming up to its 30-year anniversary. But anyway, it's very interesting about the Amish community. It's very well done. Peter Weir directed it. It's just marvelous. But anyway, they have shunning. Believe me, that's helpful. Now, is it always right? Of course not. But it's their mechanism. They give you a chance to correct by saying, well, it's hard if your family has to shun you, as well as the whole community. That gets your attention. We live in this atomistic society where we're not held to hardly anything because we can always be mobile and get other friends. See? We can lie, we can deceive, we can exaggerate, we can cheat, we can do all kinds of things because we're not held accountable. That was what, the virtue of the small community in the small town was people knew what you were doing. It's hard to hide things. That was also considered to be the vice and the limitation of it. Everybody knew your business. But have we gone too far? Interesting question. Now, lastly, we will go to Maurice. The millennial village in Africa, some of us are here aware of it, and Don encouraged me to go actually read on the website more recent information on it, so that I don't be kind of romanticize the millennial community experiments. And so I found an article by Bill Gates, which was very interesting as to why he rejected funding the millennial community. And although he has immense respect for the person behind it. What is his name? Jeffrey? Yeah. But why I'm bringing up the millennial community, because it's kind of a hyphen to Maurice, is that here you have existing villages. And here there's not intentional communities in the sense in which I'm speaking of communal experiments. But there's the attempt to go into a community and to infuse to bring certain elements that will help balance the community and make economic growth possible. And with the best motives and with the best planning and with a lot of financial support, these communities at first, because they were concentrating on certain things that were lacking, like water and seeds and so forth and so on, they flourished for a while, and then they started to have problems because the people they weren't really working with the people in the community. It was the intelligence and knowledge of people outside saying what the problem was and what they needed to do. Intentional communities are the opposite. You're responsible for what you do. You have to make it work. You have to make the rural work. You have to make everything else work. And so this creates a problem. So now we'll turn over to Maurice, who will then talk with us about the guaranteed annual income.